Okay, Deb, over to you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Today, we're going to talk some about a certain aspect of restoring our lives from traumatic stress that is kind of my favorite part, my favorite. So I'm going to start with just a really quick overview for anybody who may not be aware of like the formal or the psychological constructs around it. And plus a couple of facts I learned when I was researching, the history of how traumatic stress was interacted with over the years. And, before 1800, I'd say the word trauma applied to just injury or something breaking, like in engineering. All the way back to like Greek times. In the mid 1800s in England, a doctor noticed that there were a lot of people who'd been this was in the beginning of the use of the, steam engines and whatnot. And when there were railway accidents, there were a number of people who had strange symptoms well after their injuries were healed. And he called it railway spine. And basically for a long time was ridiculed and laughed at. No other doctor wanted to say, oh yeah, I see what you're noticing, and consider that it was something moving into that there was something other than it's either physical or it's cured, physical problem where it's cured. And he was saying, no, something's happened to these people. It's as if the humors of their spinal fluids, have been knocked around, and they were having symptoms we now know as PTSD. And then in the wars, like the Civil War, there were just so many wars all over the place from mid 1800 on that they got different terms. You would have heard terms like shell shock. I'm sorry, I forget the one that people in the Civil War, American Civil War, called it. But generally, they considered that the symptoms of traumatic stress that we call PTSD were character flaws. That if you had those symptoms, you were either a malingerer or somehow weak in your character. And that was that until, when was it? World War I, I think, maybe World War II, when you just couldn't deny, no, these people are not weak. Then, let's see, how do I want to do this? It's taken way too long to begin to recognize the different traumatic stresses that we lump as complex PTSD that happen to children, the difficult things that happen in families, the effects of severe neglect and abuse and emotional abuse, as well as physical abuse, so forth. That's called complex PTSD. And because of how it happens in the formative stages of a person's life, their identity is definitely affected, but that's not considered in most treatments that I've seen or read about. Then there's like a single event PTSD. If you have a car accident or you get mugged or things that are traumatic for some people. And then there's the complex trauma of combat. So it's not like it's kind of like more of a moving target, and not one thing doesn't have the same impact on everybody, but which can contribute to why, identity is never considered in terms of treating people. But so symptom, because of the times of, focusing on behaviors is really prevalent in Western psychology. It's very prevalent, and it's getting worse, in my opinion. Things have to be measurable behaviorally to know that you're curing people. I don't happen to think that's
Deb, give an example.
Let's see. So when I used to write my notes, and let's say one of my clients who had severe ADHD. So he was 8 when I started to see him. And one of the treatment goals was being able to focus. So the number of times per week that he successfully focused to being able to complete a task. Now that is important in life. And then another thing we focused on was being able to have other solutions instead of an explosive emotional response to something, so the number of times per week he could access and use, something other than a very explosive emotional response. That could be going up and being quiet in his room for half an hour, which he usually did himself. He would take himself to his room to calm down, then he could come back and interface. But when we started working on that represented how he didn't feel safe. His reactions represented a lack of safety, or his reactions, he had lots of symptoms. So those were just 2. And we started working on how he felt about himself, his self-esteem. He started connecting the dots much quicker, much faster. So that's an example. Does that give you what you were looking for? And I just think that, so it's harder to measure how often does a client feel safe, but it's a very important consideration. It's just not how. Well, you all get the point. So there's not only the complexity of symptoms that's not the same for everybody, whereas depression is frequently looks the same for everybody. There's a generality for everybody around depression with individual variances. There's the westernized behavior oriented. These are all things that make it really has kind of guided the treatment of traumatic stress towards behaviors and reduction of symptoms, as opposed to focus on identity. But nobody's factored in the people that have a spontaneous change in their meaning of life by their traumatic stress. They have an almost instant recovery, and they don't continue on with symptoms of PTSD. So I have been very interested in the phenomenon of identity. That's kind of the professional overview. And it's easy to talk about it that way, as opposed to what is it in lived experience? What is it in lived experience? Especially for those of us who had a lot of difficulty in our childhood, our trajectory was changed at each significant stressor. Every time you got beaten by your parents or neglected or whatever, your experience of the world and your sense of self, that trajectory changed. So you have lots of zigging and zagging, But what is it in lived experience? That's kind of what I wanted to be present to today. And so I'm inviting either one of you to, we just jump in and say what you want to say, what's coming up for you around anything I'm saying, any questions you've got. Let's start there. Let's stop a minute and go for that.
You're muted, honey.
I don't have a question, but I do have and what I think is an example. About a year and a half ago now, I had stepped down as artistic director at a theater where I'd been for doing that role for 12 years. And I left because really it had become a toxic environment for me. And I know that we throw that phrase around, but it really was. I mean, my partner had been trying to get me to step down for years because he saw what was happening to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently that sort of coincided with taking a hiatus from performing for almost 3 years, between COVID and stepping down. And I just finished performing for the first time with in a show with a cast last weekend. And that experience reinforced for me that in fact, what I had been experiencing at my previous theater was in fact trauma. And I do experience post-traumatic stress disorder, even when something as simple as somebody sends me an email asking me about, but what I really wanted to point to was what you said about identity, because that experience shaped my identity in not a healthy way. It really made me believe that I was a person who was unlikable, and that wherever I went, nobody would like me or want to work with me. And yet having this experience, which was a really good experience, I got along really well with everybody, made me realize the depth to which that experience had actually shaped my identity.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I sort of pride myself on being somebody who's kind of alert to all that, I mean, it doesn't, I sort of knew it was happening, and yet it still happened, I guess is my point. And so I think that these experiences are far more prevalent for any of us than we realize, because, Deb, to your point, we've been in such denial about the connection between emotion and cognition and behavior.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think that's really accurate, and really unaware that literally every experience that comes in, every flash of light, every whatever is part of, it's assimilated into our being as this is the composition of our life. So, and that's how we're designed, or, that's the best words I can put around it. So you're having this experience of a toxic environment, and yes, it would shape your experience of yourself, and it would shape, and in my view, do you mind me using your example? And I really should ask that before I do.
Have at it.
It would really shape your experience of yourself. Like you said, you became thinking of yourself as unlikable, and it's designed to keep you there. Stay put. And there's I was thinking, sorry, I've started to jump ahead. So let me remind everybody, I'm saying some very general, superficial facts because of the time limit and how we're doing this conversation. There's so much more that could be said. But then, so then for you to say, no, I am likable, that's quite a journey, isn't it? Yeah. And to say, this won't govern who I know myself to be. And I want to break it down into a couple things I see as important. It breaks the hold of a conditioning in the separation, fear-based world, that there's so many constructs that encourage forms of separation and fear in the society we live in, that I don't know, it really does feel like there's some they out there sometimes, but the governance of your identity will go within these lanes is strong. And nobody wants a toxic environment, but so few people realize toxic environments are made up of people and our responses to each other. So you exited, you left that environment, probably after doing a lot of things to see if you could help it change, right? Knowing you, I'm sure you did a lot. So then your choice is to leave, which I would think would carry a sadness to it, a lot. And to have to, yeah. So you had to, it's powerful that you changed your trajectory in a healthy way. But look at the time you had to spend grieving it. And I did that too, had sort of my version. I was checking to see if my sister still lived in the Albuquerque area, and noticed some, I'm not listed under family on her internet thing. And I just thought, it didn't have to go like that. It didn't have to go like that. But what if, 30 years ago, I would have had so much less access to articulation, so much slower access. This time it didn't affect me as much because I've done a lot of work on all of this, but there still was grieving. It just didn't have to be that way. A moment lost, a change in who I know myself to be, and grieving what could have been, or, what it would have been. But what's the positive side, the more life enhancing side, Janice, of you taking those steps? I don't want to rush into that if you're not finished with your grieving process. So
I do think I am still grieving, but I also am far enough in the process that I can recognize the gifts from the experience as we're learning in our PQ work. And one of it is just building that trust with my inner voice, because I think that, right, that's such a huge part of it, is like, if we can learn to trust that inner voice that is saying, move to a place that's healthier, because I feel like what we want to do is we want to give power to everybody else's assessments, right, rather than standing in our own truth. And so part of it for me is just confirmation for that, but it's also, so part of the story that I had been telling myself about staying there was, it was the only place that I could do the kind of theater that I wanted to do. And by leaving and not being able to do theater there, I've had to explore other opportunities, and I've found other opportunities where, I mean, I'm going to get to do my one-woman show in January. I got asked to direct a show by a couple of friends of mine. That'll be a really powerful piece. That'll probably happen somewhere in St. Petersburg. So there are other places that I can do the kind of theater that I want to do, and do it in a place where I'm nurtured, rather than depleted. But I feel like sometimes, like unless I had come to the edge of having to leave, I could have kept telling myself that story for who knows how many years, right?
Yeah.
I want to add a couple of things. One is that in our present society, we're caught in either or. And Janice, I think you just demonstrated that either it's here or nowhere. And it's really part of the cognitive perception that I think we're trapped in. I have clients that by the time they call me, they've been in a job they hated for over 40 years. And because there's no there in I want to ask you, Deb, I think this thing about identity has something to do with that. So that's one thing I want to put in, because I want to put three, and I hope I don't confuse the waters. The second is that often an identity gets formed as our identity forms as an against.
Yeah.
Screw them. They can't do that to me. What's wrong with those people? That they thing. And sure, there's a they, because human beings have become a lot of human beings become mob bias. But at the very same time, underneath it, which I think is part of what we decided to kind of risk this conversation without trying to have anybody draw conclusions from it, is that maybe we can just get down under some of this, and because your fascination with identity and your deep work in it, for me to survive my environment, I had to re-identify myself, or I would have been in a psych ward for the rest of my life. But I had no confidence in that identity. I had no confidence. I only knew if I didn't make up an identity, I wasn't going to survive psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
So the identity I shaped, which is the last thing I want to say, is contribution. And I think a lot of us, I think there are two forms of trauma. There's trauma that's family. Well, I think there are many forms of this kind of trauma. One is family oriented, one is culture oriented, and one is the collective humanity oriented. So those three. Somehow when I was young, I was capable, because my Papa Kent was so strong spiritually, my Episcopal minister, I could see through the lens of the crisis of humanity, and I could see through the lens of the crisis of family, and I could see through the lens of the crisis of my social existence. And I was very fortunate. And but the identity I framed was if I wasn't useful, I couldn't be here. I just didn't have the strength.
Mm-hmm.
I had no way to contribute to myself. I had no identity of self. I had no way to have value of self, which I think is the pandemic in our present world.
Mm-hmm.
That we have been trained to be devoid of self-value. I don't care who we are. I don't across the board, whether you're beat to shit as a child or whether you were raised nicely. I mean, I just was in a conversation with a client yesterday who's actually completely traumatized because nothing in her, which is where I think you want to jump to, but I'm only going to go this far and then shut up. But she's completely traumatized because she cannot step out of what she wants to do for Christmas, to go with her family, to be Christmas with her family. And she loves her family, but she doesn't want to do family Christmas. And she's over the top and terrified that her siblings are going to turn against her, that her father, who's actually ill, is going to think she doesn't love him. I mean, it's really over the top. So the value of self, the value of another human being, just being a human being, seems to be very devoid in our culture. And then if we have time, I'd like to share my PTSD event. But I want to turn it over to you, Deb and Janice, for thoughts and comments.
Anything for you, Janice, first? Okay, so yes, I think you said it beautifully. I'm using the terms in the field of psychology of like historical trauma, and the childhood part would be what I was calling complex trauma. And it's complex because of so many dimensions of our development and becoming who we're becoming adults and in part of society are affected. That's why it's called complex. And the historical part is, yes, the impact on others from the social norms and the oh, I forgot the word. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. We aren't going to know what it is.
Yeah, right. Colonization, that's the word. That whole mindset and, all the things that go with that. Yes, that's so you're just saying it in more user-friendly terms, is what you're saying. And yes, I think that's accurate. I really think that, to me, and I say this gently because I'm aware that I'm one of the few who think like this, there are a lot of really significant positive things that happened in the pandemic. One is what you just named, is we got forced out of our that lock of, we have to go to work. It's all about making the company survive, the family survive, the tradition survive, everything about other. And I think it's very complex, but part of the distress now is people have discovered their creativity and their value, and they don't know what to do with it at all. So it is distressing. But that's the nature of a traumatic experience. There's this interruption. We all go marching along with our beliefs, our understanding of how the world works, what we think is good, what we think about everything. And we have all of our little feedback loops that keep us in who we know ourselves to be, but it's almost always unexamined, unconscious, and unaware. A traumatic experience happens, and it's a sharp interruption of that meaning and that belief. Like, just to use my client, for example, that little boy, his sense of safety was interrupted at some point in his young life, for several points. So what safety was for him was no longer accessible and had to be rematrixed, and that he could have a say and participate in creating safety was like alien to him, very alien, almost threatening. So I think that also points to what you're talking about too, Tantra, is for your client to say, I'm going to do Christmas this way. And it has nothing to do with my love of you, my connection to you. It would be very dramatic. It would be very difficult for her. I can see that. And to weave that matrix of understanding, comprehension between herself and her family members and what their choices mean. It doesn't mean that she's less in love with her family, but I'm agreeing with you, but I'm trying to say it out.
Yeah, let me respond because I know what you're saying, and because the frame of the conversation is not trauma has a plus side and a minus side. And we've been shown that we must be trauma free, which basically means stay on drugs, alcohol, or television or shopping. And for God's sake, don't have emotions, just have an opinion. So we're trying to crack the code in something in this conversation, not because we're intellectually doing it, but because the three of us have been having experiences that point this way. And the point of Create a World is to speak about things that we're observing, not only in ourselves, but in the world around us. Correct? Is that say?
Yeah.
So the thing, the trauma side is her terror that her family actually might not love her.
Yeah.
And the conversation was, this should be familiar for you, Deb, is because it actually came out of our conversation that I was able to do this. I said to her, well, ask them. You have to ask them or not, because the trauma lives in the not knowing. So to know whether there's a reason to be traumatized, like, is there a reason to be traumatized? Because actually, if they don't love her, that's going to be traumatic. That's not going to be easily solved. While if they do love her, then the trauma becomes the next level of intimacy. It comes the next depth of connection. It becomes the next point of beauty in the family's relationship with herself. Now, just to add to that, she did talk to her father. She hadn't talked to everybody else. And he said, why were you thinking that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's all he said. But so there's this frozen trauma on one hand, but we don't often talk about what happens. I think, Janice, you were speaking to that. We don't talk about this an emotional phenomenon that happens when the frozen trauma starts to melt into relationship or melt into, I was telling Deb earlier, Janice and everybody, that I took my car in for an oil change. I'm in love with my brake masters mechanics, and they seem to be in love with me. And there's a grind when you first push on her gas to go off. So I asked the head mechanic came out to talk to me about old wizened guy. Looks like he should be drinking moonshine somewhere in the mountain. And he puts his hand on my arm and he says to me, honey, she's just old. And I burst out sobbing. And it was a simple thing. And my car is paid for. I love my car. I don't want to lose her. But the kindness, it literally unpacked a trauma in that moment. And what was present was tears and emotion and almost overwhelmed that someone could care about my car at the depth that the communication was given. So I think that's what I was trying to speak to about this kind of strange phenomenon we're observing and could likely be very present. That's all for me right now.
The intensity of coming alive beyond the point of, oh no, they may not love me. Oh no, I need to do Christmas for myself this way to honor my relationship to all the components of Christmas. The intensity of coming alive, and I love that you're using the term unfrozen. That really is, or that I think might have been you that said this, that when somebody comes out of a coma, it can be very, very intense. It's definitely not like what they show in the movies. They may have to relearn how to walk or talk or swallow or whatever, or be a whole other person, but it can be a very painful in many different dimensions experience. So it's a coming back online. And I think that's really true. That's what I'm getting at with the identity conversation. There's a coming back online or a renewal, like with those people that, let's say, because I'm remembering a story I heard about a young lady going off to school, idealized, just led a pretty healthy life, all these dreams and ideals and everything, and she got mugged at school. and actually mugged and raped, I believe. So that was her single event traumatic stressor, but it completely interrupted her understanding of, life is good, whatever her sense of safety was, her sense of everything. That's the frozen, boom, you're frozen. The symptoms we all know of, depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, flashbacks, explosive, intermittent explosive scenarios. I could list a ton of symptoms of PTSD, and they're not small. They're not small, and they don't look frozen. It looks very dynamic, but it is frozen. And they repeat, based on different configurations. So the coming back online is a really dramatic awakening and calls for a rematricing of your world. And that's forming a new identity, or which may have to be literally formed, like you choose and form, or there may be some sense of things and you say, how does this shape? Which, if I'm understanding you, Janice, properly, you have a sense of things, and it's now, how do I have this play out in my life or manifest in my life? That's also rematricing your world. And I do agree with you about the pandemic, that there's an unfrozeningness to invent a word that's happening, and people don't know what to do with it or how to be with it. And I also want to point out one other thing. The official definition of traumatic stress is something that's so overwhelming, it blows your circuits, your psychological, spiritual, mental, physical circuits. But we use the word a lot. People throw that word around. Oh, I was so traumatized, and I'm not minimizing people's experience. But I think it points to two things. One is the slipperiness, even though it's necessary, the slipperiness of the field of psychology is no longer separate from the people, nor should it be. But I think it also speaks to a lower and lower threshold. We don't have a threshold for something anymore, a threshold for, I'm not saying this part well. So
in one way, we're all ADHD now. We're all PTSD now. We're all in an identity crisis now. We're all, so that threshold of being able to say they're that and I'm not that, that's what I think you're saying.
And the threshold of, oh, I'm traumatized is actually coming down. It takes less to produce
Trauma.
a traumatic response.
Yes.
And I think that's actually true, which is forcing the either pathology or coming unfrozen. I do really
I think that's a really important part of the conversation. A woman that I love, have a lot of respect for, she described it to me as think of a glass of water. She said when the glass of water is full almost to the very top, it only takes a couple of drops of water for the glass to overflow. And I in the work that I do in schools, I keep trying, and I'm in Florida, so we came out of the pandemic smack into Hurricane Ian that just ripped through, the southern part of the state. And I keep saying to people, look, do you know these teachers and these children and these school administrators, they're full to the brim. they're full to the brim because of everything that's happened. My goodness, we can't come in and keep dumping on them. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that, yeah, we all experience that collective trauma together, whether we were in a state like me where things were more open, or other states like California where things are more, we all experience, and we experienced it locally, nationally, and globally. And our cup is right at the brim. And so we are going to overflow more easily. And that's not because something is wrong with us.
Yeah.
I would offer that it's because our emotions are functioning in the role that they're designed to function in a human life.
That's
something is finally right with us.
Yeah.
Right.
Because we can't help it. There's nowhere else to turn. And I think that's phenomenal. There's also very little constructs in most of Western society for actually helping each other. As you're talking, I'm hearing the only model is, well, ask more of them, teach more children, do the only model. And I was thinking, as much as I love my church, which I really do, it's very socially progressive. And they do take time to say, they have said things like, we really have to take time to grieve what happened during the pandemic. But then they go straight into help more people. And I have often found it overwhelming, really overwhelming. If you want to say grieve, what does that mean? Let's unpack that. But I wasn't in a position where I could, take charge or try. I don't mean take charge. I mean, drive the conversation more that direction. But there was that. What does that mean to stop and grieve? What does it mean to take a step back and let ourselves heal and come unfrozen, rematrix ourselves, even while there are so many more homeless people or just the need for people. It's proving the need for rematrixing. But how do you do both at once? How do you have both and? And so we're in let's just do more of the same, which wears us down, which makes the PTSD more evident, more activated, So I think it's a difficult scenario, because I even find myself, I can think these things, but I wouldn't know what to say. I wouldn't know what to say as a solution for, let's say, one of your classroom scenarios. Or I might, but it would be so sorry, people. But it would be so foreign to me to go have the opposition you've talked about, of taking care of people.
Well, it's actually not even present. Hi Zorro. It isn't even present. I mean, that's the juggernaut we're in now. It's the same as war. Exactly the same as war, because if there's a war, those soldiers have to go out every day. They have no downtime, zero downtime. And I suggest, even though I'm not at all psychologically biased, that PTSD comes from no downtime. And, there's no recovery from that interruption. There's no place to go to re-identify yourself as who you were before you walked into the traumatic event. So Janice and I've talked a lot about the teachers in Florida, and especially a couple of them, how they have no place to go to re-identify themselves and then say, Jesus, this is a BITCH. This is really hard. But what it is doing it's forcing human beings to see the need for self-value and self-care. Even a lot I think you were speaking to is no actions we know to take, but there is awareness we can take. That is an action.
Yeah.
And being aware that we're losing our value because we're being used and not cared about the result of ourselves in our personal existence. That awareness, that conscious awareness, has a tremendous amount of restorative ability.
Yeah.
Tremendous amount. Yeah.
And I agree. I think that's essential. I think the way you said it, that was very well said. It's absolutely essential to take a look at who I was before, who am I now, who am I becoming, what's different, how's my meaning about life changed, my experience of myself changed. So actually, I want to shift a little. That made me think of something. Can I use you and your example again, Janice?
Sure.
I think Janice had something she wanted to say too. Whoops, we have a froze.
I sure did, and let's see if I can remember what it was. Nope, it's gone. It'll come back.
Deb's frozen.
Deb is frozen.
So not to emulate our conversation. And
I think I can say that, maybe she's coming back to us. I mean, I just, again, I think this is powerful conversation, and I would offer, if you're listening, that one of the best things you can do for yourself is give yourself some space.
And
Yeah,
how
go
would
ahead.
that become consciously aware space? That, I think, so the thing I was going to ask you, Janice, is what has it been like for you to rediscover and re-identify yourself as, I am likable. I absolutely am likable. And I have a lot more flexibility with how and where I contribute. What's that been like?
So, I mean, it's created a lot of joy for me, joy that I haven't felt in years and years and years. But I have to be honest, it's also a little scary, because, you know, anytime you move from what you were so sure was true, it's unsettling. And it sometimes, I sometimes find myself falling into the pattern of, wanting to beat myself up for, why did I stay so long? Why did it take me so long to leave? Why didn't I? So that's part of it too. But I, in terms of, what I'm trying to choose, in the midst of a lot of the coaching work that I'm doing in Newfield and PQ, and really this notion of trying to, choose the gift is just recognizing that how much, I think, embracing how much power I do have to drive my own story. I mean, because in order for me to identify myself as unlikable, I had to buy into somebody else's story. And I had to make that choice over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So now it's in a place of, well, maybe I get to decide whether I'm likable or not. But that again is a choice that I have to make over and over and over and over again. And I did have a couple of little bumps when I was first working with this new company, and it definitely activated the whole, I'm not letting, so I had in that moment to say, okay, and it's like, well, gee, if I was likable, what's the choice that I would make?
Wow. That is so brilliant. That's exactly what I was hoping, that something like that would happen. Is, I had an experience, Tantra and I talked about this I don't know, has it been a week? But I was in a situation where I thought someone wouldn't, stay around. And then I realized later, it's not about them. I thought I didn't have enough value for them to want to stay around. And it's been a similar experience, what you just said, of having to choose and choose and choose and choose. And what is it like to say, no, I am of value, even when whatever evidence that would have proved it may not be there? But it's calling for a new set of evidence, or perhaps no evidence, just it's the truth. And that's really a cool way to say it. And I don't think it's that easy.
I want to jump in here because I didn't know if this would be relevant, what I'm about to say, but this is a very emotionally charged conversation for me. I started working as a contribution to others when I was 19 years old. I'm 76. And then in 2014, I knew why I'd come as a contribution and what was mine to contribute. And some of that is still, pieces of that are still going on. Particularly, Deb and I will be bonding next year because this whole idea of identity is so critical. And so I have 3 archetype groups, the archetype of different types of identity, which literally just give us a broader bandwidth to operate in. But up until 2021, I had a very specific body of work I wanted to get done, a little bit like a virtuoso training violinist. And I achieved that result. And then I did another 7 months to keep building it to where I could let go of it, where I knew that I had achieved something. Inside of all that, I also got COVID and lost my companion, my dog, and moved to New Mexico. So, Deb, I'll let you dice it out. But obviously, I didn't recognize ending a 55-year body of work that I had a vision about when I was in my early 20s. I did not realize it would have a trauma effect. I had no idea it would have a traumatic effect. And losing my dog was extremely traumatic. Getting COVID and being dysfunctional, like not even, I mean, literally having to cancel clients because I was starting to black out right before getting on the line with them. So the disruption of ableness was terribly traumatic. The disruption of cognitive sequencing was incredibly, and overwhelming depression, which I still fight from time to time, which is a post-COVID symptom that the doctors don't even tell people who've had COVID that they may run into. So I bought a house. I love my house. She's adorable. My dragons are in the backyard. I'm totally thrilled with the more specified, small, unique body of work I always want to do, literally like taking some of your violinists and, being able to operate in a manner that can create something powerful without having to be a public conversation. So I've always been after creating something powerful that does not have to draw the whole public to it. So I'm in that place. But here's the part I want to share. I'm just watching the time. The part I want to share is I had time for me. I've never had time for me, nor have I ever wanted it. So Liz Geyer was doing a 15-minute talk on self-care and self-value. She was talking about baking and coloring. And I could feel my identity was abhorrent that for me to take time to spend a whole day coloring or to spend a whole day playing on the piano was so abhorrent. I realized that I developed that my identity was traumatized. And then, yes, one of my clients who stayed to tend the house while I was taking care of my daughter and her dog in Tucson left me a puzzle. I spent 6 hours on that puzzle yesterday. And at the end of that puzzle, I went, oh my God, that was so fulfilling. And I'd said to Deb, something has been shifting in me. And I said to Deb, I thought I was waking up despondent and life wasn't working. And all of a sudden I realized I wasn't waking up despondent. I was waking up relaxed and undriven. And I was finding them traumatizing until yesterday. And the client that gave me the puzzle, we're meeting today at 4 my time on Zoom, and she's going to work on her puzzle and I'm going to work on mine.
Isn't that beautiful?
And it's a whole new life for me. I mean, a whole new life.
Yeah. And I actually don't want to unpack that much. I think there's too much respect that needs to be at the table right now of, not rushing in with, oh, this is that, or that's that, let it unfold. This is new territory. This is new territory. It is in the field of psychology. I mean, I'm sure I could dig up research of people sharing their experiences with this, but actually not. When I was doing my dissertation, I couldn't find much that was unique. It was a lot of repetition of the same thing with a little bit different twist here and there, but very little that was outside a parameter. So I think what you just shared really requires a lot of respect and care, and let itself become known. And I think that's the process that is part of what's necessary for helping people who've had officially diagnosable traumatic stress, as well as what we've been calling I don't know what we've called it. We didn't call it something today, but when the threshold is getting lower and lower, traumatic stress, that phenomenon. And I've really begun to look at what would that be to begin to presence this idea out in the world so people can access and rematrix identity and their own value. And then if value is of the self is the starting point, how does that change the constructs? And though the last thing I'll say is, when I was doing my dissertation, one of the greatest resilience factors that Indigenous people who had suffered possibly, well, some of the most horrific, just horrific traumas, was that they decided to relax into their traditions, the things that made them who they are. I don't mean relax into in a superficial way. I mean, draw on, I suppose would be better. That gave them more resilience and ability to rematrix their worlds, is to relax into who they are and the traditions that demonstrated that. But it wasn't, anyway, that's as much as I have time for. Because
I
that's a
just
whole
want
long
to add,
conversation.
so what I did is started my own traditions yesterday, because all these people have been so kind to me here. So I got little $5 boxes of cookies, which normally my other self would have been, oh, what a cheap gift, But I just wrote a card and said, you have been what has restored me here. And I'm deeply appreciative for your being here. And so it's interesting. It was fun. It was also fun to deliver it, especially the two white dogs that were protecting the door that I could not get in, and the person had to come out and get it. And but it came, the traditions for the indigenous people, their traditions were valuable, not social routine.
That's right.
That's the difference. And yesterday, I got to create a tradition that gave me life
Yeah.
and let me feel whole. And that's what I want to add. And Janice, just over to you, and then we'll complete.
Amen.
Oh, I think we're going to complete with a short song. Do not expect a great oratorial voice here, but here we go. Don't wake me unless you love me. It hurts too much to go back to sleep. Don't wake me unless you're a friend of mine. I'd rather stay in my dreams. So just stay in your dreams and wake slowly. And we all love you. Take care. Thanks, Deb, so much for this talk.
Yes.